I still remember the smell of bleach and loneliness that hit me the second I stepped into that care facility. The walls were this washed-out shade of mint green, the kind they use when they're trying to make sadness look sterile. The nurse at the desk barely looked up when I asked for my son. "Ethan Miller," I said, trying to steady my voice. 16 years old. My brother dropped him off here 2 weeks ago. She clicked through her computer and gave a small shrug. "He's in the recreation room, ma'am." I followed the sound of soft humming down the hall, past doorways lined with wheelchairs and faded family photos taped to the walls, and then I saw him, my boy, my Ethan. He was sitting alone on a plastic chair, knees pulled to his chest, clutching his little blue backpack like it was armor. His hair was uncombed, his clothes wrinkled. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. His eyes, those sweet brown eyes, lit up for just a second. "Mom?" he whispered. I ran to him. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." He didn't hug me right away. Instead, he pulled out a crumpled juice box from his backpack and held it up like an offering. "Uncle Drew said I can't come home. He said, retards don't need money." It was like my heart cracked clean in half, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do first, scream, cry, or run. I just stared at him, trying to make sense of the words coming out of his mouth. "What did you say, Ethan?" I asked, softly, even though I already knew I'd heard him right. He frowned, repeating carefully, the way he always did when he thought I hadn't understood. "Uncle Drew said retards don't need money. He said I'm better here, that I'm safe now." My brother, my own flesh and blood, had taken my son's trust fund. $4 million meant for Ethan's future care. Money that his late father and I had spent years securing so that, no matter what happened to me, Ethan would be okay, and Drew convinced my sweet, trusting boy to sign it away. I looked around the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against my chest. The other kids were coloring quietly. One of the staff smiled politely from across the hall, completely unaware that my entire world had just imploded. When I confronted Drew that evening, he didn't even bother pretending to be sorry. He stood in my parents' living room, arms crossed, chin high, that same smug look he wore when he thought he was smarter than everyone else. "I did what needed to be done," he said, like this was some kind of business decision. "Ethan can't manage that kind of money. You can't either. You'd waste it on feelings and therapies that don't work." My voice was shaking. "You stole from my child. You used his trust, literally and legally." Drew shrugged. "He signed. It's done. You can't undo it without dragging your own family through court." And then my mother, my own mother, said the words that cut deeper than anything Drew could have said. "Hannah, think rationally," she told me, arms folded tight across her chest. "Ethan doesn't even understand money. Drew's just making sure it's used properly. He's being practical." Practical. That's what they called it. Not betrayal, not exploitation. Practical. I looked from her to my father, hoping for some kind of support, but he just kept his eyes on the floor. I realized in that moment that I was completely alone in this house, full of people who shared my blood. So I didn't scream. I didn't break anything or throw accusations. I just stood there, frozen, while Drew poured himself a glass of whiskey and said, "You'll thank me one day when you realize I saved you from yourself." He walked past me, brushing my shoulder with a cold familiarity that made my stomach twist. And in that moment, I decided something very important. I wasn't going to cause a scene. Not yet. Because if Drew thought he'd outsmarted me, he had another thing coming. 6 months later, when Adult Protective Services knocked on his front door, the look on his face would tell me everything I needed to know about justice. And when Ethan pointed at him, voice trembling but clear, and said, "That's the bad man," it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about truth, about innocence finally being believed. But standing there in that facility with my son's words echoing in my head, "Retards don't need money," I promised myself one thing. I would never let anyone silence his voice again. Not Drew, not my parents, not anyone. Because my son may not understand money the way the world does, but he understands good and evil. And that day, he showed me exactly which side my brother was on. Before everything fell apart, our life was small, but it was ours. Just me and my son, Ethan, in a little 2-bedroom house tucked at the end of a quiet street in Portland. The neighbors knew us mostly by the sound of Ethan's laughter when he bounced on his backyard trampoline, or by the smell of the blueberry muffins he loved to bake, always insisting on too many chocolate chips. Every morning started the same way. I'd wake to the rhythmic tapping from his room, Ethan arranging his Lego ships in perfect rows. He'd call out, "Mom, breakfast mission time," and I'd play along, saluting him like a commander. Autism didn't make him less. It made him see the world differently, sharper in some places, softer in others. He could memorize every moon of Jupiter, but forget to wear shoes outside. We had a rhythm: therapy on Mondays, grocery day on Wednesdays, pancakes on Fridays. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. And after losing his father 3 years earlier to a sudden stroke, that peace felt sacred. My brother Drew would visit occasionally, usually unannounced, always dressed like success. Tailored jacket, that expensive watch he liked to flash when he gestured. He'd bring Ethan some flashy toy and spend half an hour pretending to be the fun uncle. I used to be grateful for that effort, until I noticed the way his compliments always had edges. "You're doing great with him, Hannah," he'd say, "but don't you ever think about yourself. You've tied your whole life to his condition. You should let professionals take over someday." I'd smile politely, pretending I didn't hear the judgment hiding in his words. Drew had always been the golden child. My parents, Margaret and Frank, practically glowed when they talked about him. Their successful son with the degree, the investments, the charm. Meanwhile, I was sweet Hannah, the one who tries her best. Their tone said everything. At family dinners, they treated Ethan like an awkward topic they didn't know how to handle. Mom would cut his food for him without asking. Dad would glance nervously whenever he flapped his hands in excitement. Drew, of course, would make jokes that sounded like concern. That Thanksgiving, the air around the table felt heavy with unspoken things. The turkey sat untouched while Drew unfolded some glossy brochure and slid it toward me. "I've been meaning to talk to you about Ethan's trust," he said casually, like he was offering me dessert. "You know, to help you manage it better." I frowned. "Manage what? The trust is locked until he's 18. "Exactly, which means it's just sitting there," he replied. "You could be investing part of it, building it for his future. I could help. I manage portfolios like that every day." Mom nodded eagerly, wiping her hands on a napkin. "That sounds responsible, honey. You know you're not good with numbers." I set my fork down. "I'm good with my son, Mom. That's what matters." Drew leaned back, smiling the way people do when they think they're being patient. "I'm not trying to offend you. I just want to make sure Ethan's taken care of. Emotion doesn't belong in finance, Han." Emotion. That was always his word for weakness. Ethan, sitting between us, hummed softly, unaware of the adult storm brewing over mashed potatoes. I reached over and squeezed his hand. He smiled, eyes focused on his plate, safe in his little world. The conversation shifted, but the tension stayed. I noticed the way my parents glanced at each other whenever Ethan spilled something or repeated a line from his favorite movie. That quiet pity. They didn't say it out loud, but I heard it anyway. After dinner, while I was packing leftovers, Mom followed me into the kitchen. "You know," she said softly, "your brother just wants what's best. Maybe let him help. It would take some pressure off you." I shook my head. "Ethan's not a burden. He's my responsibility." She sighed, that disappointed teacher sound I'd known since childhood. "You can't do this alone forever." "I've been doing it," I said, turning to face her, "and I'm doing it well." That was the last real conversation we had before everything spiraled. At home that night, I tucked Ethan into bed. He asked, "Did I do good today, Mom?" "You did perfect," I said, brushing his hair back. He smiled, eyes heavy with sleep. "Uncle Drew says I'm getting older. Maybe I can sign my name on grown-up papers soon." My stomach tightened. He said that. "Yeah, he said it means I'm smart enough to help you." I kissed his forehead, whispering, "You're already smart enough. Don't you forget that." I stood by his door for a long time after he fell asleep, watching the nightlight glow across his face. Something about Drew's words, about that brochure, about the way my parents had nodded along. It all felt wrong, but I pushed it aside. Family, I told myself, meant trust. I didn't know then that the people who raised me would stand behind the man who would take everything from my child. For now, the house was quiet, safe, filled with the steady rhythm of Ethan's breathing. I let myself believe that peace would last. I was wrong. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday. Ethan's school called to tell me he hadn't shown up for his morning program. I thought there must be a mistake. He never missed school. I checked the house, his favorite park, even the corner cafe where we sometimes stopped for muffins. No Ethan. I called my brother. "Hey, Drew," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Is Ethan with you?" There was a pause. Too long. Then his voice came, smooth and collected. "Yeah, I picked him up early. We're spending the day together. You worry too much." My stomach dropped. "You can't just take him without telling me." He chuckled. "Relax, Han. He's my nephew. We're fine." I wanted to believe that, but something in his tone felt rehearsed. Hours passed. No text, no call. When I finally tried reaching him again, my calls went straight to voicemail. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside felt like a threat. Every car that passed could have been his. By morning, I was calling hospitals, the police, anyone who would listen. My parents told me to stop overreacting. "Drew said he's got everything handled," Mom insisted over the phone. "You need to let him help." "Help?" I snapped. "He's taken my son." Her voice turned cold. "Watch your tone, Hannah. You're making this worse." 2 days later, I found out where Ethan was, not through my family, but through an email from a case manager at a care facility an hour outside the city. The message was short, professional, detached. "Your son, Ethan, has been admitted for long-term developmental care under the authority of his legal guardian, Andrew Miller." Legal guardian. I read that line over and over, unable to breathe. My brother had somehow become my son's guardian. I drove straight there, hands shaking the whole way. The facility sat at the end of a long gravel road, hidden behind iron gates. It looked more like a detention center than a care home. When I demanded to see my son, the receptionist smiled politely. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Miller has instructed us that you're not to have direct visitation without his consent." That's when I realized he'd taken everything, not just the money, my rights as Ethan's mother, too. I went home and tore through my files. Bank statements, trust documents, letters from the attorney who had helped set up the fund years ago. I found new forms, ones I hadn't signed. Ethan's signature scrawled across lines in childlike loops, Drew's neat signature beside it. He had manipulated my son into signing away his trust. I sat on the floor surrounded by papers, shaking so hard I could barely hold them. I called Drew again. This time, he answered. "Drew," I said, voice trembling. "What did you do? How could you do this?" His tone was maddeningly calm. "I didn't do anything. I protected Ethan's assets. You're too emotional to manage that money. You'd waste it on therapists and whatever nonsense you think helps." "Those nonsense therapies are what make him smile, what make him feel safe," I shouted. He laughed quietly. "He's 16, Hannah, not a baby. He needs structure, not sympathy. You should thank me for stepping in before you ruined his future." Then he hung up. That sound, the click of the call ending, rang in my ears like a gunshot. When I told my parents, I expected outrage. Instead, my mother's face tightened in that familiar way, the one she used when she thought I was embarrassing the family. "Drew said Ethan's getting professional care," she said. "Maybe this is what he needs." I stared at her. "He needs his mother, not a stranger's institution." My father cleared his throat. "He's thinking long-term. He's being practical." That word again. Practical. It made my skin crawl. I realized then that I was completely alone. My family had chosen their golden son over the child who needed them most. That night, I drove back to the facility. I parked down the road, hiding in the dark, and watched through the fence. I saw Ethan through the window, sitting on a cot, rocking back and forth, his little backpack clutched to his chest. I wanted to break the door down, to grab him and run, but I knew if I acted without proof, Drew would bury me legally. He'd make me look unstable. So I swallowed my rage. When I got home, I collapsed at the kitchen table. My hands were shaking too hard to hold my coffee. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "You have to be smart, Hannah. Not loud, smart." I opened my laptop and started searching. guardianship fraud, trust fund manipulation, adult protective laws. I didn't know exactly how, but I promised myself one thing before the sun came up. I would get my son back, and when I did, Drew would. Never hurt him or anyone else again. For the first few weeks after Drew took Ethan, I moved through life like a ghost. Work emails piled up unanswered. The house felt hollow without the hum of Ethan's tablet or the clatter of Lego pieces on the floor. Every corner held his shadow. Every silence sounded like his laugh, just out of reach. I knew storming the facility would get me arrested, and lawsuits cost money I didn't have. But silence didn't mean surrender. It meant strategy. I started by pretending to give up. I called my parents and forced my voice to sound calm. "Maybe you're right," I told my mother. "Maybe Drew's plan is for the best. I just want what's best for Ethan." There was a pause, then that relieved sigh she always gave when she thought I'd finally come to my senses. "I'm glad you're seeing reason, Hannah," she said. "You can trust your brother." Trust. The word burned. That night, I opened the old shoebox where I kept Ethan's baby photos and the last letter his father had written before he died. His words steadied me. "Protect him fiercely, Hannah. The world won't understand him, but you do." I realized I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for my son's dignity. The next morning, I drove downtown to meet an old friend, Maya Thompson, a former college roommate who now worked as a social services investigator. She was one of the few people I'd ever trusted enough to tell the whole story to. When I walked into her office, she stood up, eyes wide. "Hannah, you look exhausted. Sit. Tell me everything." I told her about the forged papers, the facility, the way Drew had turned my parents against me. By the time I finished, her jaw was tight. "This isn't just a family dispute," she said. "It's exploitation. If Ethan was manipulated into signing anything, that's fraud under disability protection laws." I leaned forward. "So what do I do?" Maya opened a folder and started making notes. "First, we gather proof. Financial records, witness statements, audio, anything. We'll build a paper trail." Her calm efficiency sparked something in me I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Over the next month, I became meticulous. Every night after work, I documented everything. I recorded my calls with Drew and my parents. I requested bank statements. I even volunteered at the care facility under a community outreach program Maya helped arrange. The first day I walked back into that building, my hands were shaking. I wore a volunteer badge and carried boxes of donated puzzles. Ethan was in the common room, stacking wooden blocks. He didn't look up until I whispered, "Hey, champ." His eyes widened. "Mom?" "Shh," I said softly. "It's okay. I'm helping the staff today. I just wanted to see you." He reached for my hand, gripping it like he was afraid I'd disappear again. "Uncle Drew says I can't go home. He says you get too sad." I felt tears sting, but I forced a smile. "That's not true, baby. Mommy's just working on some things. You're doing so good. I'm proud of you." He nodded, then whispered, "Can we go home soon?" I swallowed hard. "Soon, sweetheart. Very soon." When I left that day, I sat in my car and cried until my vision blurred. But underneath the heartbreak was a steady pulse of resolve. Seeing him there reminded me why I couldn't quit. Maya filed the first formal complaint with Adult Protective Services 2 weeks later. She warned me it could take months for an investigation to move forward, but I didn't care. For once the system was moving, slowly, but toward the truth. Meanwhile, I played my part. Family dinners, polite smiles, even fake gratitude. I needed Drew comfortable, overconfident. At one Sunday lunch, he smirked over his wine. "See? Things are calmer now that you're letting professionals handle it." I looked him straight in the eye and said evenly, "You're right. Maybe I overreacted." He raised his glass. "To family." I clinked mine against his and thought, "To justice." That night, I met Maya in her car behind a coffee shop. She handed me a small voice recorder. "He's arrogant," she said. "Get him talking. Arrogant people love to brag." A week later, I called Drew and asked to meet. Over lattes at his favorite cafe, I pretended to seek financial advice. He smiled that familiar, self-satisfied smile and started talking about fixing the trust, correcting the signatures, and streamlining assets. He didn't know my phone was recording every word. When I sent the file to Maya, she said quietly, You just buried him, Hannah. I sat back in my chair and finally exhaled. For the first time since Ethan was taken, I felt in control. I had spent months being quiet, underestimated, dismissed. But silence had given me power. I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I was a woman building a case, brick by brick. And when the time came, I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't beg. I would let the truth speak for itself. 6 months after Drew took everything from us, the day finally came. It started like any other quiet morning. I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed. It was Maya. Her voice was low but steady. They've approved the investigation request. Adult Protective Services is sending officers to Drew's property today. They want you and Ethan present to confirm identity and testimony. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All the months of waiting, documenting, pretending, it was all leading to this. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "Just tell the truth," she said, "and let Ethan do the same." I hung up, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. That afternoon, I picked Ethan up from the care facility for what would be the last time. He was sitting in the courtyard with Scout, his therapy dog, drawing little circles on a notepad. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" I asked softly. He looked up at me, uncertain. "Can we really go?" "Yes," I said. "This time, no one can stop us." He smiled, a small, fragile smile that made my chest tighten. When we arrived at Drew's house, 2 black SUVs were already in the driveway. The officers from APS stood beside a county detective. The air felt heavy, electric, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Drew opened the front door with that same practiced confidence he wore like a suit. "Well, look who's here," he said, smirking. "What's this, a family reunion?" One of the officers stepped forward. "Mr. Andrew Miller, we're conducting an investigation into potential financial and guardianship exploitation. We have questions regarding your nephew, Ethan Miller." Drew's eyes flicked to me, then to the officers. "This is ridiculous. My sister's unstable. She's been harassing me for months." "Mr. Miller," the officer interrupted, "we have documentation showing multiple unauthorized fund transfers, including signed consent forms believed to be fraudulent. We also have recorded statements and bank records linking your accounts to the trust fund." For the first time, Drew's mask cracked. His jaw twitched. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Then Ethan stepped out from behind me, holding Scout's leash tightly in one hand. He looked smaller than usual, standing there in front of everyone, fragile but unflinching. The officer crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "Ethan, do you know who took your money?" The world went quiet. Even the birds outside stopped their noise. Ethan's lip trembled, but his voice was clear. He lifted his hand and pointed straight at Drew. "That's the bad man." Drew's face drained of color. For a second, I saw pure disbelief in his eyes, not because he was caught, but because he never thought Ethan's words would matter. "He's confused," Drew stammered. "He doesn't understand what he's saying." The officer straightened. "We understand enough." He turned to another investigator. "Read him his rights." When the cuffs clicked around my brother's wrists, I didn't feel joy. Not exactly. What I felt was release, like a weight sliding off my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Mom and Dad arrived halfway through the process, having been called by Drew's wife. My mother's face was pale as chalk. "What is happening?" she demanded. "Why are you arresting him?" The officer answered plainly. "He's being charged with financial exploitation of a dependent adult and fraud." She turned to me, eyes wide. "Hannah, tell them this is a mistake." I met her gaze, calm and steady. "It's not a mistake, Mom. It's justice." My father tried to speak, but his voice faltered. He looked at Ethan, then quickly looked away, unable to face him. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to beg for their understanding. Their silence said enough. As they led Drew toward the car, he twisted back toward me. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You're nothing without that money. You'll always be weak, Hannah." I didn't answer. Instead, I knelt beside Ethan and brushed his hair from his eyes. "You okay, baby?" He nodded. "You said we'd fix it." I smiled through tears. We did. The officers gave me a small nod before leaving. Maya joined us moments later, carrying a stack of documents and a look of quiet pride. "It's over," she said. "He won't be able to touch either of you again." I stood there, holding Ethan's hand, watching the car disappear down the street. The sky above was turning orange with sunset. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely. Ethan tugged on my sleeve. "Can we go home now?" "Yeah," I said, exhaling a laugh that was half sob. "Let's go home." As we walked toward the car, Scout trotted beside us, tail wagging. Ethan whispered, "Mom, did I do good?" I squeezed his hand. "You were perfect." He smiled. I told the truth. "You did, sweetheart," I said softly, and that truth changed everything. When we reached the end of the driveway, I turned back one last time. The house where Drew had planned his schemes, where he'd hidden behind lies and arrogance, looked smaller now, stripped of its power. That was the day I stopped being afraid. That was the day my son's voice broke through the noise and the world finally listened. It's strange how silence feels after justice finally speaks. For months, every sound in my house had echoed with fear. Phones ringing, lawyers calling, the endless hum of anxiety in my chest. But after Drew's arrest, after the hearings and headlines and paperwork, there was only quiet. Not the empty kind, but the peaceful kind. Ethan and I moved into a smaller place on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, creaky floors, and a backyard that backed up to a line of pine trees. But it felt safe. Every morning, the sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, catching the dust in the air like gold. Ethan would sit at the table feeding pieces of toast to Scout, his new golden retriever service dog, giggling when the crumbs disappeared. The first night we slept there, he asked, "Mom, are we home now?" I pulled the blanket up to his chin. "Yeah, baby, we're home for good." He nodded, satisfied, and whispered, "No bad men here." I didn't realize how hard I was crying until he reached up and wiped a tear from my cheek with his thumb. "Don't be sad, Mom," he said. "We're brave." That word, brave, became the truth I held onto. The court later confirmed what we already knew. Drew had forged Ethan's consent and siphoned almost 3/4 of the trust fund into shell accounts. He pled guilty to financial exploitation of a dependent adult and was sentenced to prison. My parents didn't attend the hearing. I heard they moved to Florida soon after, claiming they needed space from all the drama. I used to think I'd feel triumphant watching him led away in handcuffs. But when it happened, all I felt was an ache. My brother's face, once familiar, now hollow, looked like a stranger's. Part of me wanted to ask him why greed mattered more than blood, why he'd rather destroy his family than admit he was wrong. But I didn't. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. In the months that followed, life settled into something steady and honest. Ethan went back to school part-time, his teachers amazed at how quickly he adapted after everything. He started therapy again, and for the first time, he asked to join a community robotics club. One Saturday, as we left the meeting, he turned to me and said, "Mom, when people do bad things, do they stay bad forever?" I thought about Drew, about my parents' silence, about how long it had taken for the truth to break through the lies. "No," I said carefully, "people can change. But first, they have to want to." He nodded, looking thoughtful. "Then I hope Uncle Drew learns." I realized in that moment that Ethan's heart was bigger than all of ours. Despite everything, he still believed in forgiveness. For me, healing came differently. I started volunteering with families of disabled children, mothers who whispered the same fears I once had. What happens to my child if I'm gone? Who will protect them? I didn't have all the answers, but I had a story, and sometimes that was enough. I tell them that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. That there's strength in watching, in waiting, in knowing exactly when to fight back. Some nights, when the world feels still, I sit on our porch with a cup of tea and listen to Ethan talking softly to Scout inside. The laughter, the normalcy, it still catches me off guard. I think about the woman I was before all this, the one who thought family automatically meant safety. Now I know better. Family isn't just blood, it's whoever stands beside you when the world tilts against you. For me, that was Ethan, and later, Maya. She never asked for thanks, but every victory we earned had her fingerprints on it. I send her updates every few weeks, photos of Ethan building robots, Scout wearing funny hats, little reminders that good people can still win. She always replies the same way. "You did that, Hannah, you protected him." Maybe she's right. When I look back, what surprises me most isn't Drew's cruelty or my parents' betrayal. It's the calmness that grew inside me when I stopped begging for their approval. That calmness became my armor. If someone asked me now what I learned from all of it, I'd say this: you can't teach someone empathy, but you can show them consequences. You can't erase evil, but you can outlast it. And sometimes, the softest voice in the room ends up being the one that tells the truth loudest. Ethan taught me that. The day the judge ruled in our favor, he held my hand and whispered, "We did it, Mom." "Yes, baby," I said, squeezing his fingers. "We did." And now, whenever I hear him laugh, really laugh, that unfiltered sound that fills a room, I know the story didn't end with revenge. It ended with freedom. Justice didn't give us back the money, not all of it anyway. But it gave us something more important: peace. So when people ask if I'd ever confront my brother again, I smile and tell them the truth. I don't need to. Because the last time Ethan saw him, he pointed with steady hands and said, "That's the bad man." And the world finally listened. When I look back now, I don't see just the pain. I see the courage it took to stand in the middle of it and not let it define us. My son lost more than money that year. He lost his sense of trust, his safety, his place in the world. But in that same moment, he found his voice. And that voice, soft as it was, changed everything. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that justice doesn't always come wrapped in grand gestures or perfect endings. Sometimes it comes quietly in a small, shaking voice pointing at the truth. So to every parent out there fighting for their child, to everyone who's been silenced by people who were supposed to protect them, you are not alone. Stand your ground, protect your peace, and never underestimate the power of patience and truth. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to tell, but if sharing it helps even one person protect their child or speak up against exploitation, then it was worth every word. If this story moved you, if it made you think or made you feel something, please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more real stories that remind us how strong the human spirit can be. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? I read every single one. This is Hannah, and this was our story. Thank you for being part of it. See you in the next one.